Screw it, let's do it is the name of this panel. So this is going to be, there's going to be some overlap with the previous panel, but this is going to be a deeper dive into community solar projects. We're going to be looking at what people can do under current policy to bring renewable energy, especially solar, into their communities, and share examples of things happening right now. You'll hear that electrical co-ops have more flexibility to bring community solar into their communities than investor-owned utilities, but there are a lot of things that can be done in smaller community projects, even within those investor-owned utility service areas. I'm going to ask that each panelist introduce themselves and then give a short talk about the project or projects that they're working on. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A with questions from the audience, and maybe we'll even have questions across the panel as well. I think we've been asked to identify 3 major takeaways from this discussion, and perhaps we can work together to see if we can come up with those takeaways to share with the larger community later this evening. So I'm going to call on people in a certain order, if that works, and let you talk. And Mark Hayden has a presentation, and so we'll show that, and then we'll bring the lights up as well. So I think actually what I'd like to do is start with Andrew. And again, maybe you could talk about the Montana Community Solar Project, what it was. Many people have probably heard that, and some of the conclusions that you've made already from that.
Sure. So my name is Andrew Valainis. I'm the Executive Director with the Montana Renewable Energy Association. And we have 3 focus areas. We're a statewide organization based in Missoula. We do education and outreach. We do some policy and advocacy work, lobbying of the legislature. And we also represent the industry here in Montana. We're not a trade organization, but we do a lot of work to try and represent them as best we can. One of the projects that we worked on that falls into more the education and outreach segment was a project that we partnered on with the Montana Energy Office at the Department of Environmental Quality. And they're working on a 3-year grant that they got funding from the U.S. Department of Energy to work on investigating opportunities for community scale projects in Montana. So the last panel we talked about community solar, as in shared solar, virtual net metering. Community scale solar also includes things like installations on community buildings, like parking lots, like city buildings, things like libraries, and also group purchasing programs, which I think we'll talk a little bit about later. So part of that, there are kind of multiple phases to that project. The first was a market assessment, which was done by a firm looking at kind of what the landscape looks like right now, and that's available on the DEQ website, and I can help you get that link. The second phase was information gathering about what communities see as their vision for solar and what they want to see moving forward. And the third phase is for DEQ to actually go out and provide assistance to communities based on the discussions they had, and I'm sure they'll be collaborating with a number of the organizations that are represented at the Expo this weekend. So we went to 8 communities. We went to, we went to Malta, Great Falls, Miles City, Billings, Missoula, Butte, Bozeman, and Polson. So we had one in Butte just last week, actually. And I think some of the more common themes that popped out, we kind of talked to them about, as I mentioned, 3 different types of community scale solar, the shared solar, the community buildings, and the group purchase programs. And some of the themes that jumped out were there was a lot of interest in the shared solar specifically. We've got a number of co-ops doing shared solar right now, which Mark will touch on. And people find that really interesting. They find it as a great way to make solar a little more accessible, benefit from the economies of scale. There was also a lot of interest, I think what was interesting from some communities, some of the smaller communities, in things like group purchase programs and community buildings, because especially for places like Miles City and Malta that don't really have a solar industry or a solar industry near them very much, it makes it more easy to contact an installer and convince them to come out to a community and look into solar. So the idea being, instead of coming out to somebody driving from Bozeman to Miles City to do a site assessment, an installer driving out there, to do a single site assessment, if you go out to do maybe 30 site assessments, or if you're going out to do a site assessment for a larger building, like a public library or a city office, it makes it a little more worth it for them, and can kind of get them out there and get things off and running. And then once you have a couple installations up, then the community starts talking about it more, and then you can kind of drive projects forward. So we'll be working on a summary report of those meetings, and we'll be sharing that in the coming weeks and months. And I would encourage you all to read them. But it should be interesting to see, I think, how those different communities and different cultures across Montana kind of view solar and see as the future.
Excellent. Mark, could you get to introduce yourself, and then we can go through your presentation. You can just tell me when you want to advance things.
All right. My name is Mark Hayden. I'm the general manager at Missoula Electric Co-op, and I'm the only utility guy here, so I'm under the bright light. Missoula Electric Co-op serves about 15,000 meters in western Montana and eastern Idaho. We have 40 employees. We're the third largest electric co-op in Montana, but putting us in the big scheme of things, we serve about 26 average megawatt hours, and in the utility world, we're still very, very small. But that's our strength. We're locally governed, democratically controlled. I like the fact that AERO, works with these democratic organizations and finds that as a strength. And I think John mentioned earlier, I didn't know where this was heading, but I like the fact that he appreciates co-op ownership of these types of systems, and this is exactly what we demonstrated. So if you want to advance the slides, I just included a few slides from a much larger presentation. So, why was community solar right for MEC? And my first bullet point says we surveyed our members, but we didn't survey our members to ask if renewable energy was something they wanted to invest in. This is just part of a broad survey, and when I looked through that, I saw about 10 times that it came up out of hundreds and hundreds of surveys that said, we'd like the opportunity to invest in renewable energy, or we would like locally produced energy. I think I had 9 or 10 of them in that survey. And that was enough to take to the board and say, when we're seeing this pop up once in a while, we need to consider, it's much broader than that. Now, remember, we are all requirements customers of Bonneville Power. 97% of the power we buy every day is carbon free. So this was one of the best tools that I had to educate my own members about the benefits of the resource we have each and every day. So that being said, there were still people who wanted to buy locally produced renewable energy. So we kicked it off and went forward with a plant or a site in Lowell, Montana, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Members having choice was another thing I heard on those surveys. This tremendous opportunity for us to gain firsthand knowledge. We go to the legislature too. We hear what's being said at the legislature. Whether or not solar installations can have a benefit to the utility. Rather than arguing and debating this, let's actually install a system, take our load curves and overlay production curves and see how much benefit this thing is giving to us as a local electric co-op. And then finally, we have such a robust energy efficiency program that this was a great opportunity for us to enhance that a little bit. So quickly, the benefits that I see for solar. It talked about why do people want to, the last panel said, why do people want to participate? A lot of people don't have a rooftop that's suitable. It might be a wooded area. They might rent their property. Those are the obvious ones. But for us, we have a number of members who have geographically distributed meters. They don't even own the property that the meter's on, but maybe they would like to participate. Maybe they're a governmental entity, a church, a not-for-profit. We looked at all of those and said, how can we allow them to participate at the same level, because they can't take advantage of tax credits, that you as a homeowner could. And then we wanted to make it portable on every members, throughout our system. Finally, we wanted an interest-free loan program, and we made that part of our kickoff. So phase one of this system we built in late 2015 was a 176 panel, 50 kW array. We had what we called a couple of anchor tenants. I talked about those businesses that have many meters across our system. The local telecom co-op was one of our first anchor tenants that bought in a number of panels. And we held what we called the Take 5 campaign because, again, 95, last year 97, but year over year, 95% of the power we buy is carbon free through Bonneville Power. So Take 5, offset 5% of your usage, and you can go to bed at night knowing that your portfolio, the energy you buy, is carbon free at your home. And that was a tremendous, selling point because people can't afford to invest and offset 100% of their usage. But why would you want to if you're buying it for those environmental concerns? So, sold out within, because of a couple big anchor tenants, sold out, and we looked for a second array. Now, $700 a panel was that first price point. We got a $50,000 Bonneville grant plus a REAP grant, as I mentioned earlier. 25% of the project cost was able to, we were able to offer those for $700. We didn't have the same grant opportunities in the second one, so we had to figure out a way to build this thing that wasn't quite as expensive. And we reached out to the Frenchtown Schools, a great partner for the first utility co-op school partnership in the state of Montana. 51.5 kW array. We sold out everything that we allotted. We didn't know what the production on this one was going to be compared to the first array, and we didn't want the production to vary too much because we knew this one would be covered with snow. Actually, that array produced 4 kilowatt hours in the month of January because it was covered in such deep snow. We had more snow than we usually have. So this one doesn't even have a year under its belt, but it's going to produce about what the other one produced. But we're holding back a few panels. We might augment the one panel production output if we find that the system isn't producing quite as much. So I think I have one more slide. What are the benefits? I think I've been through most of this. The large upfront cost, people could buy in at 1 panel or 20 panels. Leveraging the grant funding, Give 10 program. We also reached out because we wanted everybody to be able to participate. We reached out to businesses. They donated panels that we then raffled off, basically drew through our LEAP program to make sure that participation was available to those who couldn't afford it. Because let's face it, a lot of people can't even cough up $700 to pay their electric bill, let alone invest in a solar panel. So we were able to give. We wanted to give 10%. That's why we called it Give 10. The panels sold out before we had about 5% of our panels. So 25-year participation. I think I have maybe one more slide. Final thoughts. I'm really proud of our board for getting into this early, and then taking that next step when the first one sold out. I mentioned this earlier. The current Montana property tax models mean we pay property taxes. We did go and negotiate or make sure that we could get a 5-year tax holiday, but after that we will pay taxes for the life of this investment. There are other business models out there that you don't have to pay property taxes on these investments, and that's kind of a concern there. And this does not compete with traditional rooftop. It complements it because a lot of people can't participate in that, using that. So I'll leave it at that, Mark.
Okay, thank you. All right, Jim Baerg, can you talk about the project that you've been involved with?
Sure. I live in Livingston. It's a town of about 7,500 people. And there's kind of two things I might mention. One is through AERO a few years ago, I put on a solar PV do-it-yourselfer workshop. And so I advertised, and we got a gang of people together, and I had just decided to put a system on my roof and do it all myself. And so the idea here is you can really save a lot of money if you do all the labor yourself. I have a very steep roof, and there were some kind of tough aspects to it, but anyhow, we had this workshop and went through all the parts, how the whole thing was put together, and got some good publicity off of that, and I installed a system, and then, so now, and after that was all put in, the neighbors would come by, hey, what's going on over there? And I says, well, I just did this myself, and it cost me $5,000, and now I have a utility bill of $4.10 a month for the rest of my life, right? And bingo, that, you know, so now I have 2 neighbors on my block who have put up systems, and they've hired installers to do those, and then I've got some other people out there that are, it is churning and it's going to happen. So that was kind of a little bit more of an individual effort. And then beyond that, I'm a member of Yellowstone Bend Citizens Council, which is a Northern Plains affiliate. And Sydney comes down monthly. We have monthly meetings, and one of our main activities is pushing PV. And a couple of years ago, we facilitated putting a system on the city library and did a bunch of publicity over that. And right now, we're working on putting a solar system on the Senior Citizen Center. And the Senior Citizen Center is right downtown. It's a 3 or 4 story old brick building, and on the ground floor there's some business tenants, and then there's a main community hall and a community kitchen, and they run a bunch of programs for seniors in there. And the upper 2 floors are 24 low-income rentals for seniors. And all of that electricity runs through a single meter except for those commercial tenants, and they got a great big flat roof. Right, and they have, I don't know, $10,000 a month utility bills or something like that, right? And so, okay, so we're going to take this on. They were enthused about it, so we got a dealer or an installer to go up with us, and we talked it over, and he made a proposal, and so now we're responsible for putting the funding package together to pay for this. So it's about $2 a watt, 50 kW installation, so we need about $100,000. And so we're going after a USB grant, which is administered by the power company for about 1/3 of that. And then we're putting together kind of a pretty serious fundraising effort. We have a new hospital in town, and so they brought the pros in to show us, you know, to do it right, the way that it's most cost effective to raise a bunch of money. So we have that model, and so we put together lists of, well, Livingston and Park County's got a bunch of deep pockets. You know, it's kind of a resort area. It's a, you know, there's some well-to-do people around. So we felt optimistic, like we could raise $30,000 or $40,000 through fundraising. So that's the main effort that's going to go on, and then after that we want to go after a low-income loan through Ben's program at DEQ for the balance of that. So the more fundraising we can do, the less money we have to borrow. So we're right in the middle of that one, and then once that's, and then coming up behind that, the Shane Center is a theater in town that uses one of the old schools with the big theater on it, and they've got their own board. It's a non-profit organization, and we're going to do a similar program with them. And then beyond that, we sponsored a REAP workshop. REAP is a funding mechanism through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they, in rural areas, will fund either through grants and loans renewable energy projects to businesses. And so we sponsored a workshop, got a fair amount of interest from business people, but what stopped all of that was just the complexities of the application process. And so what we decided to do is we're becoming experts on the application project. We're going to go back to those people that were interested and say, if you're still interested, we will kind of lead you through or babysit or fill out all of those forms and help you through that and expedite all of that. So so that's kind of what we're doing. We're also starting to work more and more with the city, county government to do some work on their facilities. So we're hitting it, you know. We're trying to, wherever there's an opportunity within the restrictions on the legal and financial restrictions, we're kind of trying to work with all of that to get as much done as possible. So that's that.
Is that all?
Well, over a period of years. Okay, it's not happening this week.
I'd like to bounce back now to Andrew to talk about the Solarize Missoula project.
Sure, yeah. So first stepping back about what a Solarize program is. So Solarize is a term that you'll hear commonly used to refer to a group purchasing program. And Solarize is something that started in Oregon and has taken root and is now being run. Solarize programs are being run all across the country very successfully. And essentially what a Solarize program is, it's an organized effort either by a single entity like a nonprofit or somebody who's just really motivated, or a group of individuals who get together to kind of organize an effort. But effectively what you're doing is you're coming together to try and benefit from financial economies of scale and knowledge economies of scale in going solar. And the way they're typically set up is you have educational workshops that help local community members understand the process of going solar. You'll have installers or installers, a single installer or multiple, participating in the program who will be the ones doing the installations through the program. You'll have local partners, typically nonprofits, financial institutions, usually the municipal governments typically are involved in a lot of these, kind of helping them get off the ground, do the outreach, providing additional resources, and then you kind of move forward, and it's an organized way to get people to go solar. So I see the benefits of Solarize campaigns in kind of 4 different ways. One, are addressing 4 different issues of what some people see as the barriers to going solar. The first is complexity. So going solar can be really complicated. It can be really easy and it can be really complicated, and it can be anywhere in between. And those educational workshops that I mentioned typically cover the process. That's one of the main points of going to the workshop is these are the exact steps you need, this is the application you need, these are the permits you need, these are the fees you can expect to pay, and they really demystify the process for you so that you can walk out of that meeting saying, okay, great, I know exactly what I need to do, as opposed to just saying, okay, well, I want to go solar, where do I even start? The next benefit is addressing costs. So I mentioned there are typically installers signed up for the program, involved in the program, or a single installer. Because these programs result in a large number of installations, you can normally benefit from economies of scale financially. So the installer will work on a price or work at a price point that's pretty competitive. Nobody's guaranteeing rock bottom prices, but you'll probably be getting a good price. And more than that, at these educational workshops, you can also educate people about the cost of solar nationally, regionally, in your state, what's going on locally, and so you have that information about kind of where that price falls compared to others. And then contractor, knowing your contractor does good work, just like any other contractor that you would go after, plumber, electrician, whatever it might be. Does this person do good work? Are they going to work on a timely scale? Are they trusted? Are they easy to work with? Kind of some of those issues. And by kind of vetting the installer or installers before starting the program, going in that who's ever doing your installation does do good work. And then I think the 4th part is motivation, being part of something. And I think people who aren't really sure if they want to go solar or not, who are kind of on the fence, or people who have never heard of it before but maybe passively heard of it, when they hear that 15, 20, 25, 45 of their neighbors are getting solar installations, that can be motivating. You kind of want to be part of that movement. Same reason we're all here this weekend, right? We all want to be part of something. So MREA was involved in the first Solarize program in the state, and we ran it back in 2015 and 2016 over the winter of 2015-2016 in Missoula. We had a couple of key partners, Montana DEQ, the City of Missoula, Climate Smart Missoula, local advocacy group who has been around this weekend, Amy Selenberg, and also the Missoula Federal Credit Union. And the credit union and the DEQ, when I went back and talking about costs, one of the other benefits of having those project partners was financing options. So not just understanding what your system's going to cost, but having people there who have resources about how you can finance it and how you can pay for it and different options for those. We had 2 educational workshops. We had 4 participating installers. Missoula's a bit of a bigger market, so we went with the multiple installer model, which we had seen elsewhere around the country and kind of followed some of the best practices in doing that model. We had 300 attendees across the 2 workshops, 150 site assessments, and out of those 150, we had 45 new installations sprinkled across Missoula. And there could have been more. Mark alluded to things like shading, roof angle, roof tilt, roof structure. That's another one that prevents some people from going solar. you might be ready to go, but if you have to redo your entire roof so that it's structurally sound to support the system, that might push it to be a little financially unreasonable for you, which is another great benefit to shared solar installations. But we were really excited about that project. We consider it a huge success. And DEQ is actually spearheading a project right now as part of this community solar initiative. They are working on finding a contractor to organize 4 additional solarized programs around the state, and then using the Missoula program and those 4 programs, they hope to kind of provide a kind of a Montana solarized guidebook. DOE has a national solarized guidebook that we used in the Missoula project, but there could be a lot of great educational opportunities coming out of this program.
So John, you've heard about co-op shared solar. You've heard about site-specific community projects. You've heard about solarized. What else is there? What are we missing? What can be done?
I don't think you're missing very much, frankly. Andrew did in the first panel sum up, I think, really well kind of the 3 most common, I think most effective strategies for doing community-based solar. There's the solarized model that you just talked about that doesn't require kind of any kind of complex investment structure, but can be just a group of individuals. Not that it's not complicated still, the process of going solar, but that it is a way for communities to come together. And in particular, I also think that that model is really useful for getting people engaged in thinking about the energy system in a larger way as well. That now that they are producers of energy themselves, that they're interested in thinking about, well, what is it? What were the policies that allowed me to do this, like net metering, and how would other people follow in our footsteps and do this? And what does it mean for our town now that a bunch of our energy is coming from a local resource and that we hired local people to do the installation, et cetera? So I think that's a really powerful model. I'm, full disclosure, I'm on the board of a group called Solar United Neighbors, which does a solarized model but with a cooperative structure, so that the people who are participating are actually part of a co-op when they do that. And it's been largely on the East Coast, but it's kind of coming across now through the Midwest. So I think that's a really powerful model. Another one that Andrew mentioned is public or community institutions, like the project that Jim's working on. The one you talked about reminded me of a group out in Oakland called Revolve. Theirs is a sort of pay-it-forward model where they get donations in order to do installations on community buildings to help them offset their electricity bill. But a portion of the savings is used to seed the next installation on another community building. They've actually gotten a fair number of significant grants from both private philanthropy and from like the Department of Energy. So that program continues to grow, and the nice thing is that it gets bigger every year because each new solar array provides more seed money for additional projects to be done. I think that's a really interesting model, and it helps get around some of the issues you have around ownership structures for community energy. But I also just think public buildings in general. We did a report a couple of years ago called Public Rooftop Revolution that just looked at where are the cities in the states that have policies that make it easier to do public-private partnerships to capture the tax incentives, and what do the economics look like and how much solar could we get. Because the best thing about doing solar on public buildings is that everybody benefits when the city pays less for its electric bill, and because it means more money for other essential public services. So I think that's a really crucial way to look at that, and I think it's important for cities to think about that. There are always budget crises for cities for lots of different reasons. So whatever they can do to lower their costs is a benefit to everybody. And then of course there's community solar, and I think the examples that have been talked about already about co-ops doing community solar projects, I think it's such an important way when you think about the way that the energy system is changing and people are thinking more about, well, how can I have choices as an individual? How can I be an owner in our energy system? And many people realizing, hey, I'm already an owner in my energy system. I'm a member of a co-op, or I'm, my community has a municipal utility. Or thinking about, for folks who are served by an investor-owned utility, where is the opportunity to make policy change? Because unfortunately, in most states, that has to happen. That the rules that we set up 100 years ago for those utility companies don't allow for other competitors to that model, and that now that we have technology that allows for that, there's no reason that we have to stay wedded to that monopoly business model. And that can be a very hard sell. There are a lot of people who are used to doing that for many, many decades, and it takes a lot of organizing and discussing. In our first panel, we had Northern Plains Resource Council and other folks who do a lot of that organizing, and that's what it takes, is getting people together. And that's, again, I think that ties back into these other things that you can do, whether it's getting solar in public buildings as a way to save money for the community, but also to demonstrate to people this can happen here. Or a solarized project, it motivates people to start thinking about, well, what are the other barriers to us doing this more broadly that I think that can be leveraged then in those bigger conversations about how we change policy to make it happen, more easily and more affordably in the future.
Thank you. All right, at this point, if there are questions from the audience, questions from panel members to panel member to, yes.
Hacking the monopolies. So I am wondering about your opinion of having, if there was a federal carbon tax. So the Public Service Commissioner, one of them in Montana, Travis Kalula, is for a carbon tax, and if you read some of the stuff he's talking about, he talks about the monopolies. You kind of, that might be surprising to most of us who know the Public Service Commission, but he really has thought about it extensively and does put that in, but he doesn't think it's politically going to happen. However, there's, some of us in the room are in a citizens climate lobby, which is working on making it politically palatable by having a revenue return to the people. But if that was, I mean, that can have so much influence on, if you raise the price of fossil fuels slowly, hopefully, that's going to make a lot of, like, just look at a school system. We're building new schools in Bozeman all the time because of population, and they're looking at their systems, and they're comparing different, like they looked at geothermal and they are doing some, but it makes the whole equation different in terms of what you're going to choose. And it makes solar, obviously with no carbon in it, price competitive, even more than it is normally. And so how do you think that the utilities, I actually have talked to the Northwestern Energy, and they said, well, we like that better than regulation if you had an economy-wide price than regulation on and clean power plant kind of stuff, or clean power plant and a tax. So I'm just kind of, your background, I just was wondering, how do you think they would react from your perspective?
Well, I think it's really important to distinguish between an investor-owned utility like Northwestern and a co-op or a municipal utility, because the whole structure of the conversation is completely different. What I see as happening with the way the technology is going is that we have an opportunity to change the ownership structure and the flow of economic benefits and financial benefits of our energy system fundamentally. When you have a co-op or a municipal utility, you already have a democratic governance structure that allows for you to change that system and adapt it to the new reality. Now, some of those are stickier than others, and we've written a report called Remembering the Electric Cooperative that goes into some of the details, and Northern Plains has covered this, some of their work they've done on co-ops about, there are some institutional barriers to that, but overall the system is structured in a way to let people change it and have control. Northwestern Energy will do whatever you want as long as the shareholders get 10% return on investment. So if you have an economy-wide carbon tax, they'll be happy to build you solar and wind projects that are the most cost-effective as long as they can be company-owned and their shareholders make a 10% return on investment. And my argument is, in an economy where lots of people are willing to build solar and wind projects and maybe at a lower rate of return, why should we give them that rate of return that they've always had? We don't need to have a monopoly anymore in order to get this stuff built.
Right.
So the problem is, of course, when you get down to that question of like an acceptable political conversation, it reminds me of one of my favorite terms from political science, which is called the Overton window. The Overton window is meant to represent the area of acceptable political discourse. And the good news is that it moves. If you followed national politics in this country over the last 20 years, you know that it has moved around. Or even in the last election when Bernie Sanders is up there talking about free college and public financed health systems, that window can be opened and closed and moved left and right. And so that's my job, frankly, is let's move that window a little bit and start talking about the question of monopoly ownership of a system by a private company, which 100 years ago there was lots of rationale for. It made sense. I won't get too much into the details on that. I've written a lot about it. It's all free on our website. Go ahead and check it out. But I think that's a key and crucial question here, is that when we have a co-op or when we have a municipal utility, we can organize locally and we can have our say about how that system should be structured. And maybe what we say is, hey, we've got 95% free or carbon-free electricity already from our purchases of hydropower, but some people still care about local energy. So yeah, we're going to do some local investments in a way that fits in with that. You saw that from the Delta Montrose Electric Co-op and Kit Carson, which I talked about yesterday, that were members of Tri-State. Now their supply was not carbon-free, but they still wanted more local control, and they were given in the structure that they had with other co-ops. And so they were looking at different ways of adapting that. So I think ultimately, whatever it is that we think is appropriate, we have to be willing to organize around that and change the politics around it. And a large part of what I do is to help people understand, like, there's a lot of assumptions baked into the system. And one problem that I really have with the monopoly structure of the system is that there's so much political power concentrated in utilities that have economic monopolies that we kind of forget about that until we go to the legislature and try to get change to do something good, and we realize, gosh, we're playing on their field at their price, and every time we score, we kick the ball back to them and they get to start over again. And so I think we really do need to be trying to figure out how we change that conversation and that model. One good example of this, the only investor-owned utility I've seen in the entire country that's really voluntarily moving forward is Green Mountain Power in Vermont. And the reason is that they changed their legal registration to be what's called a benefit corporation, which means that they now have the legal obligation to consider more than shareholder return in the way that they are dealing with in their business model. And so I think, what I would love to see is states say, all electric customers should have the choice to be served by a utility that is either community-owned or is a benefit corporation by a certain date. And if Northwestern Energy wants to become a co-op or a benefit corporation, great. Otherwise, they should give up their monopoly and let us find a different way to organize the system. I don't have a lot of votes lined up for that one.
Hey, Mark. I'd hate to make an additional comment after that excellent exclamation point that we just had, but I think one thing, which you kind of alluded to as part of the question, mentioning the PSC, I think one thing we're seeing too when we're talking about change and incremental change, especially in Montana, is even though it's an investor-owned utility, we do still have democratic power at when we vote. And I think people don't understand sometimes, specifically, the importance of PSC races. And I know that's something that MREA has talked about, working on education with Montanans to understand the importance of, really, if people want to change an energy system, understanding the power that the PSC has. And that, I'd be happy to have that conversation afterwards too, but not just at the legislature, but at the PSC as well. In Montana, those are elected officials.
I just want to bounce on that in particular, because being from Minnesota, where they're appointed by the governor and it takes like 10 years to turn over that body, to be able to elect them directly is an enormous power. And there's a great example too of public service commissions are responsible for making utilities comply with a 1978 federal law requiring competition in electricity purchasing. And the way that those commissioners interpret and apply that law matters enormously in whether or not utilities will face competition for production of renewable energy. And there's really incredible examples recently in Montana of how they have done that by saying essentially to the utility, well, if you want it to be this shitty of a deal for third parties to do energy, you have to do it under the same deal. So if you want to build a power plant, you have to do it under the same terms. Michigan actually just recently had some great revisions to their state compliance of this federal law, which is called PURPA. I'm not going to bother to spell it out. Just Google it if you want to know about it. But anyway, commissions can have enormous authority in the way that they can help structure the system and give customers choice. And so I would definitely say that as a place to spend your energy is make sure that you elect good people.
There's one other program in Vermont that's pretty interesting. There's a state utility, it's an efficiency utility, and they pay people to save energy. And they provide, there's all kinds of interest-free loans for all these things. A state utility whose sole goal is to conserve energy. It's pretty cool.
Wow. There are a number of states that do that, where they separate out the money for energy efficiency programs and give it to non-utility entities under the correct assumption that utilities have a fairly severe conflict of interest in helping people reduce their energy use.
I'd like to ask Mark a question, and I'm hoping we haven't been beating up on utilities too much. But You know, the question of electric co-ops has been around for quite a while, and my understanding going back a few years has been there's been kind of two groups in the state. One is some of the western co-ops who are maybe supplied by BPA, and there's a different series of requirements that they work under. And also they tend to be in areas where there's growing load, where the populations are growing, businesses are growing, so they've got a business where, you know, it's growing, you know, and the cash flow is maybe better there. Whereas if you go out to Macomb County or Valley County Electric Co-op, and those places are really suffering, and their loads are going down pretty radically. And so for them to support solar, which will destroy their business even more, it's quite understandable that they're not enthusiastic about promoting an alternative to the way they've been doing it. So I mean, I guess my question to you is to give us this sort of a, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but give us a sense of the range of co-ops out there and what they're facing.
I think you're right on. You know, Western Montana has grown, you know, much more than Central Montana. Now if you go to far Eastern Montana, that's exploded with oil production in that whole development area. But every co-op is different. Every co-op is locally governed, and every co-op has their own concerns, whether it be their power supply, load growth, or you know, flatlining growth. But I think you have seen, or at least my sense is, that there has been an incredible shift over the last 5 years in co-ops across Montana, with opening, you know, at least the conversation on whether or not to build a community solar. There may be 4 started, but there are a lot of them talking about it. There are a lot of them studying it. You know, so, but each co-op is different, and they have different values probably. You know, whether it's a farm ranch community might be different than our Missoula community, for example, because we're not primarily farm and ranch. You know, that would be one example I would use that they're maybe more conservative, but they're all locally governed, right? So you have a say in that. So,
Thanks. Sure. Jody?
When you talk about the grid, you have to work with them on their grid, you know, the Northwestern's power grid. Is there co-ops that have decided, well, screw that, we're going to build our own grid too?
well, we own our own distribution system. Okay. We, however, take transmission service from Northwestern Energy. Every one of our substations takes transmission service from Northwestern. So when you say the grid, and you know that's a term that's thrown around pretty loosely, transmission grid is one thing, distribution grid is another thing. We all own our own transmission grids. We own transmission as well, but primarily it's owned by Northwestern. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Well, I guess how does that affect the fact that you have to work with Northwestern and there is no other competitive?
Right, so Montana law says that if Northwestern has served your property or ran service to your property originally, you're going to take service from Northwestern. If the co-op served that residents first, you know, the co-op will serve it. You can't switch, there's no choice in terms of your supplier. Even if there was choice in terms of supply, you know, you would probably have the last mile, the distribution portion of that would remain Northwestern or remain the co-op.
So the way that's kind of laid out is there are generation facilities around. It could be BPA with their dams, or it could be Basin Electric with their coal plants and their wind farms. And they contract with the co-ops for the power, but the power oftentimes has to come via Northwestern Energy's power lines to your substation. So there's a contractual relationship. You pay for the power, but you also pay for the transmission.
Right, And it's all through Bonneville Power, so as a Bonneville customer, we write one check out a month. Maybe there's some other things, but we write one check out a month to Bonneville Power. The power is generated via the dams or the Columbia generating plant. Transmitted over Bonneville transmission lines to a point at which they transfer to Northwestern, at a point which they transfer to us. So it's a complex network of
Janet?
Well, we tried to touch on this just a little bit about conservation. Why do you think that that part of energy, conserving the resources rather than moving more towards renewables, why has that just kind of slipped through the cracks, it seems like, in this whole picture of moving away from fossil fuels?
I'd love to take that one because we you know, in the Bonneville system, we have such a robust energy efficiency program. Last year alone, we returned over $539,000, and we're a small utility, in energy efficiency rebates to commercial lighting, residential homes, industrial projects. So
Wow.
33% of the power costs we pay every month go to either fish and wildlife mitigation or energy efficiency and conservation. So if we eliminated all those things, we could cut 1/3 of the cost of the power we pay to Bonneville each month. So we haven't lost sight of it. Others probably aren't quite as aggressive, but it's part of the mandate in the Pacific Northwest through Northwest Power and Conservation.
So that's more specific to Bonneville?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Anything
Well,
else?
as you said, it's a conflict of interest. They want to sell power, right? I don't know, utilities tend to not make money on the power itself, but they make money on having the necessary generating facilities there to make the power. So it's a conflict if it's just like any store, they want to sell as much stuff as they can because they make a profit on it. So that's their incentive. In terms of the general public, we like our toys. And I'm in the business of conservation and the battle I fight, but people, the discussion goes to the toys. Let's have a simple idea that will solve our problems. Let's go buy something new and shiny.
Well, I think it's also important, a couple of things about that too. One is for like city-owned utilities, which you would think would have more of a public interest. A lot of times they have payments from the electric company, or the electric department into the general fund. So selling less energy means you actually shrink the city's budget. So there is a tension there for municipal utilities a lot of times. You also have too, I think just a component of American culture, conspicuous consumption, which is like people bought a Prius because it was when you bought a Prius, everybody knew you were an environmentalist because that's the only thing that has a Prius thing on it is a hybrid car. So that and now they have little things that they stick on hybrid cars to show that it's a hybrid car. And so it's the same kind of thing with energy conservation. I can put new insulation in my home and nobody knows it's in there except for me. That's boring, but I can put solar on my roof and my neighbors come and ask me about it, now they're going to do it. Well, that's really cool. So I think it's, you're fighting that battle as well. I think, the economic interests there have often driven the conversation more than anything else, but there's also a cultural, and social component to it as well.
Can I have one last comment to that? I actually have heard some interesting anecdotes though. I think there might have even been a couple examples out of the Solarize Missoula out of some of the follow-up. People who went solar largely because it was visible, because they want to go solar, because it's the right thing to do, not necessarily the economic benefit. And they haven't really invested in energy efficiency yet. All of a sudden you get a panel on a roof, you start to see your energy use dropping and it gets pretty low and people start thinking, I wonder how I can conserve energy around my home in order to really flatten out my energy use. So a lot of what we hear discussion is conservation first, renewable energy afterwards, and if you motivate in the opposite direction.
I've had 2 months this year for the first time ever not paid for any electricity, not paid for any natural gas. And that's just like, it hit me emotionally. It's like, I did something there, And, I'm more than happy to pay to be connected to the grid, and I think $4.10 is absurdly low. It doesn't pay for the lines and the wires and all the service they provide, but, that we have to have I think we need to renegotiate what those kind of rates are. I think sometimes some of the electric co-ops, if I was hooked up to Park Electric, I'd pay $32 a month instead of $4 a month for the pleasure of having a solar system on it. And that becomes prohibitive.
But
So,
just important point, but your volumetric charge would be way lower.
yeah.
Yeah, electric,
yeah,
just
yeah,
a point.
Yeah,
Yeah. But that is a really good.
so, there is a, beyond the pleasure of showing off your new toy, there is the pleasure of accomplishing this drop in your utility rates. That is powerful.
All right, I'm sorry, but I think we've reached the time limit for our panel, and I want to make sure that we can all get back down to our next event and so on. But I'd first like to have a round of applause for our panel.